Thank you all for coming. I'm Alec Holcomb, the director of the Contemporary History Institute. That's the organization that sponsored this event. Thanks for braving the cold to get here. Really appreciate that. Hope some of you can make it to the keynote address tonight and to the panels tomorrow. I'm going to turn things over to Cody Billick. He's a PhD student here, and he's going to be the moderator for our first panel, which focuses on Indochina.
Thank you. So as Alex said, my name is Cody, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you to this year's Baker Peace Conference, which focuses on the immediate aftermath of the Vietnam War. Later tonight, as Alec mentioned, we will hear a keynote address from Dr. Peter Zinnemann, seated front stage here, a leading historian of Vietnam. And over the next 2 days, we will explore the post-war decade through 3 panels covering Cold War superpowers, including the Soviet Union, China, and the United States, the broader Southeast Asian region, and the immediate region of Indochina. And that immediate region of Indochina is the focus of our first panel tonight, which was the region most directly affected by the Vietnam War and its legacies. We will hear presentations on Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam from 4 distinguished scholars. Our first speaker tonight is Alex Dival. He is a historian at the Vietnam Center and Archive at Texas Tech University and is an expert on the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. Our second speaker, Ian Baird, is a geographer at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, specializing in mainland Southeast Asia, with a specific focus on Laos, Thailand, and Northeast Cambodia. His talk tonight will focus primarily on Laos. Our third speaker, Sophal Ear, is a political scientist at Arizona State University and an expert on Cambodia. And to round out our 4 speakers is Tuong Vu, a political scientist at the University of Oregon, and he is an expert on Vietnam and especially the Communist Party. Since this panel has 4 presentations tonight, which is more than our other 2 panels tomorrow, we're going to try to keep the presentations to 20 to 25 minutes so we can go to the fancy President's Dinner afterwards. And also to allow time for questions and answers at the end. So without further ado, I will hand it over to Alex.
Thank you, Cody, for such a nice introduction. Hello, everyone. Can you hear me? I don't know why I got pushed up. I was supposed to be 3rd in line, right? But now I know because I'm the most junior of them, right? So bear with me. Wow, nervous, huh? Being the first one? No. Well, thank you again. Alec, my dear friends, right, he's here. My research mate from, 20 years ago? Almost. Yeah, we spent so many days at the archives together and then lunch together talking about research, Vietnamese history. And about, I think, 6 or 7 months ago, you called me, right? And you asked me if I could talk about the Vietnamese diaspora, which is an area that I recently just engaged with, being a Vietnamese refugees myself in America, coming to America when I was 9. And he kind of asked me to speak from the perspective of who constitute the Vietnamese diaspora, especially in America, why they left, where did they go to, and what does this diaspora tell us more about the Vietnam War and its consequences and whatnot. So up here you will see a quote from a person I interviewed who kind of summarized what I kind of use that as a basis for my talk today. And the talk is not going to be as scholarly, but it's going to be more reflective, so that I guess you can see from the angle of the people that, the subjects that which I'm working with, the Vietnamese, within the Vietnamese diaspora here in America. The Vietnam War did not end in 1975. It lives on in the exile of fractured people, in memories of loss and survival, and in the enduring struggles of Vietnamese diaspora to reclaim their dignity and history. So I want to preface that the talk today, the diaspora, Vietnamese diaspora internationally is very vast and wide, right? Coming from different political, economic, social background, political affiliations and whatnot. My concentration for this paper is going to be the diaspora resulting from those who left Vietnam as a result of the end of the Vietnam War and its consequences, those who are or were associated with the former Republic of Vietnam. So the Vietnam War ended on April 30th, 1975. So this year is going to be the mark of the 50th anniversary of it, with the fall of Saigon. But for millions of Vietnamese across the country, peace never came. Its consequences have not faded for them. For those associated with the Republic of Vietnam, the end of the war marked the beginning of political persecution, economic deprivation, and forced displacement. Though the war faded in much of Americans' memory 50 years after the war, especially 53 years after the American finally withdrew from the war in 1973, its consequences, its repercussions still haunt those, especially Vietnamese, who survived the aftermath of the end of the war. Immediately after reunification in 1975, the newly established Socialist Republic of Vietnam sought to transform Vietnam into a country that aligns with socialist lines. Yet these policies deepen wartime wounds. And these policies, I hope my colleague Tuong Vu will expand upon more in terms of the high politics of decision-making right there. Former South Vietnamese officials, military personnel, intellectuals, and religious figures between 200,000 to 300,000 were sent to what is known as re-education camps, sprawling prison complexes where they endure forced labor, psychological indoctrination every day, every night, and indefinite detention. They were sent to re-education camp with really no terms, no term limits, right? The term re-education in Vietnamese is called cải tạo, belies the grim reality of starvation, disease, and arbitrary punishment. Many never returned. And those who did became broken men and women, alienated from their society as well as their family too. The struggle of a father who's been away for 7 years and coming home, or 10 years coming home and try to mend that relationship with the son or the daughter who had just been born when he was sent away. Imagine that. And as a result, they were permanently marked as outcasts in that society. For their families, life was equally brutal. For the wives, for the sons and daughters, for the parents of the detained were stripped of their properties, of their houses, of their jobs, and also economic, educational opportunities that we here are privileged to have, for example, with many forcibly sent to what is known as new economic zones, bastions, wasteland, where they labor without adequate tools, foods, or medicine. So hunger was constant for people during this time, from 1975 to around 1985, 86, if not even more. Mothers rationed their rice, often pretending to be full in order to feed their children, some overwhelmed by the pressure, by despair, contemplating ending their lives, but then torn by the obligations to survive in order to care for their loved ones when the husband is not around. So Vietnam's centrally planned economy brought much devastation in the 1970s, late 1970s to the 1980s, starting with a rigid anti-capitalist policies that confiscated people's private properties and suppressed market activities to enforce a socialist system. Collectivizations of agriculture and nationalizations of industry disrupted many people's livelihoods, especially those in the South associated with the former Republic of Vietnam. Farmers were stripped of their land ownerships and forced into what is known as the inefficient cooperators, right? Leading to chronic food shortages and even famine. In cities, private businesses were closed down. Their owners were denounced as bourgeois. Tens of thousands were expelled from their urban centers, their homes confiscated, with their future shuttered. As poverty deepened, the state tightened control, rationing food, banning private trade, and criminalizing dissent. Yet, repression could not mask the reality for many people. Survival in post-war Vietnam was for many untenable. Desperation for these people drove them in the hundreds of thousands to flee by land, but most by boat. So they're known as the boat people in the 1980s, all the way up to the early 1990s, embarked on perilous journeys cramped into makeshift vessels that are as big as these tables, or maybe a little bit bigger, with 10 to 20 to 40 people on a vessel, braving storms, pirates, and starvations in hope of reaching foreign lands, not knowing exactly where they're going, actually, right? It's easy to speak now, to recognize that they are now in America, in Australia, in Canada, but bring ourselves back to 1985, 1982, and them pushing their sons and daughters up into these vessels, not knowing exactly where they're going, if they would survive. But why would they make that trade? Others survive only to be, so many as a result perish, drown at sea. Many were raped, and to this very day cannot talk about it. Many were murdered by pirates or lost to the endless oceans. Others survived only to the languish of refugee camps. Many were stuck in refugee camps for 5, 10 years. Some didn't even get a chance to come to America or to Canada or Australia, awaiting resettlement in a world where some view them with apathy, and then others will view them with indifference and suspicions. That was the reality with Americans' reception to the first few waves of Vietnamese when they were boat people and refugees, as Americans were suspicious of why are we bringing these people in, burdening our economic situations here in America in the 70s and 80s. Yet their flight was more than an escape. It was an act of defiance against a system that sought to very much erase them. Thus, the Vietnam that emerged in the wake of what we know as unification was not a land healed by reunification, but one fractured by policies of control and exclusion. The suffering of those left behind and the struggle of those who fled were inextricable parts of the war's legacy, one that extends beyond the battlefields of Vietnam or even Southeast Asia, that is, Cambodia and Laos. For Vietnamese refugees, the past is not a distant memory, but a shadow that still to this very day lingers, shaping their identities, defining losses, demanding recognition. The war may have ended 50 years ago, but its consequences remain etched into the lives and the memories of those who lived through it, particularly those in the diaspora. So the fall of Saigon created waves of immigration, of people leaving Vietnam. So I'm going to spend the next 5 minutes talking about this wave. So the fall, as I said, it was not just a collapse of a government but the shattering of a nation and its people. That is a national loss and family separation. As North Vietnamese tanks roll into the capitals that most of us who study the Vietnam War have seen through pictures and films, right? Fear gripped those who has ties with the former Republic of South Vietnam. And as a result, you see thousands upon thousands of people shedding their uniforms, their guns, meaning shedding their own identity in the moment of reunification. And then those who crowded the US embassy gates, pleading a way to get out. Others fled to riverbanks and seaports in order to seek out as vessels or any other mechanism to escape. For many, during this period, exile was not a choice, but survival. For the first wave of refugees, including South Vietnamese officials, government officials, military officers, professionals, and intellectuals who understood that what awaited them under communist rule. Their fear proved well-founded by what I just talked about earlier, about re-educations, about the policy, post-war policy. So many of them who escaped in 1975 were fortunate to be resettled in America and getting their life rebuilt, but while also carrying the weight of their lost homeland. But for the exodus was far from over, right? It was not just the first wave of people who left in 1975. In the late 1970s, under years of oppressive communist rule, economic mismanagement, and international embargo from the US and Western nations, and the continual costs of military mobilization in the wars against China and Cambodia in the late 70s and early 80s, saw another desperation to leave Vietnam, but this time in silence and darkness, right? So the second wave this is known as the second wave, known as the Boat People, comprised mostly of former South Vietnamese citizens, ethnic Chinese across the country, as well as many others who were deemed as enemies of the state. With no formal evacuation plan for them, they clandestinely took the sea on overcrowded boats that I just mentioned, gambling their lives, sending their sons and daughters against pirates, typhoons, and starvations. Many never made it. Some estimation that the South China Sea is now the graveyards of an estimated 200,000 of them, if not more. Others fled by land through Cambodia and Thailand. Those who survived these languished had to spend months, years in in refugee camps in Cambodia, in Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, Singapore, Hong Kong, and the Philippines. As the world, as the US, as Canada, as Australia debate on what to do with them. So in response to this humanitarian catastrophe after the war, carrying on from 1975 to the early 1980s, the international community, the UN, established the Orderly Departure Program, commonly known as ODP, in 1979, offering a safe and legal pathway for Vietnamese for approximately 500,000 Vietnamese to leave Vietnam. This is known as the third wave of refugees, who, though through a more structured program, was no less painful. Families were separated by war, were reunited, but the scar of re-education camps, the scar of separation, of forced labor, of state suppression lingers and affects their relationships when they see each other again. Among the ODP beneficiaries were the Amerasians via the 1988 American Homecoming Act, which is an act that allows for children of American servicemen and Vietnamese women who in Vietnam were ostracized within Vietnam, yet became strangers in the lands of their fathers. And just imagine that. These people came to America and all of a sudden were put in Utica, New York, in random places in Arkansas, Texas, and asking them to navigate lives. Just imagine that, right? Others included those who seek family reunifications. So you have family in America, you can reunify with them. Others included US employees. The majority among them included those who were imprisoned, prisoners of war after the war, who were imprisoned 3 years and more, along with their families, were allowed to come to America. Just think about it, right? The status of a refugee, the status of opportunities, chances, is based on the amount of year in which you serve in prison. So those who serve 2 years and 364 days cannot go because they didn't qualify. They didn't stay long enough. They didn't suffer enough, I guess. But that is not the choice of the Vietnamese to make, right? Not the choice of the refugees. So next, I'm just going to talk a little bit, and among the refugees, you also include the minorities, the Khmer Kroms in southern Vietnam, as well as the Montagnards in the central highlands, and you also the Cambodians too, Laotians too, as well as the Hmong. So you don't want to forget those, and we really need more scholarship to really approach those topics, those people. Next, I'm just going to talk a little bit about the communities, the diaspora communities in these areas that they migrate to, the US particularly. So the Vietnamese exodus after 1975 is a story of profound loss, resilience, and survival. Families were torn apart and scattered across continent, even across country, right? Carrying with them not only memories of the fallen nations, but also an unyielding determination to rebuild through much struggle, though. The escapes unfolded in waves shaped by by host nations' policies, their diverse background, as well as the resources available in each nation, right? So many faced the sea, overcrowded refugee camps, and many years before they could really, relocate in an area. So the United States took in 800,000 refugees. Many were first housed in military-run camps before they were being dispersed throughout. But usually they were being dispersed into regions that are, in terms of climates, are very unfitting for them, right? They were sent to Arkansas, Dakotas, instead of Californias, instead of Florida, where the temperature is more equated for them, right? Canada brought in 60,000 via the private sponsorships of refugees program. And then Australia brought in 90,000, while France, because of its colonial tie with Vietnam, brought in about 100,000 former officials, intellectuals, as well as artists who, through their efforts, also preserve Vietnamese culture in cities like Paris and Lyon. Before reaching this new home, many endure the struggles, the pain, the post-war struggles that I just mentioned in the 1970s and 80s. Those who once settle, refugees face immense struggles, right? Initially with what is known as dislocation that I just mentioned, right? Where they were located and then have to move again, seek out better places that can better suit them. And then those others most face language barriers, economic hardships. A lot of people came empty-handed. My family came in 1990 via a better program known as the HO program, and we had only $200. But I'm sure many other families have worse stories, right? Economic hardships and psychological scars of war. Many worked, as a result, they have to start working in factories, garment factories, restaurants, washing dishes, and domestic workers, and nail salons, right? Before establishing stability in the Silicon Valley, in positions like I am right now, or some of my colleagues now at universities and whatnot. But that took years. That took almost 50 years, generation, to get there. Some, like Vietnamese fishermen in Texas, had to endure the struggles against racism. In Australia, Sydney became a hub of resettlement for many, but also a flashpoint for anti-immigrant because of gang-related issues in the 1990s. That was also the case in Orange County, California, as in most newly immigration communities. Yet the diaspora, through all those struggles initially, persevere and try to flourish. It's not all beautiful, right? But they try to. Communities like Little Saigon in California, or in Sydney, or in Toronto's Vietnamese enclaves became vibrant centers of culture and commerce. Vietnamese refugees revitalized local economies, opening restaurants, nail salons, and even grocery stores. Their cultural contributions, things such as like pho restaurant and banh mi sandwiches shops that are so popular in all these YouTube channels that you see now, right, are popularized by these people that they carry with them. The aozai, the long dress that they brought with them, right? The Buddhist temples, Catholic churches, and Tet festival that which they try to recreate in America, in Australia, in Canada, became enduring facet of their adopted homelands. But the diaspora, as much as they try to rebuild their lives in America, abroad, they also remain deeply tied to their homeland, that is Vietnam, deeply, especially those of the first generation and the 1.5 generation, sending as much as 16 to 17 billions in remittance annually home, marking a significant amount in Vietnam's GDP. Culturally, they affect Vietnamese music, arts. Politically, many engage in activism, demanding for democracy and human rights for Vietnamese in Vietnam. It's through the efforts of many Vietnamese abroad that people like journalist Phạm Đoan Trang or journalist Huy Đức, who prominent journalists who spoke up against the regime and captured and imprisoned by the regime, are known internationally and being advocated for their release. It is through the works of these immigrants who care about their homeland and what is happening. But not just that. These people also contribute to the local politics, running for mayors, for congressman seats and various seats. So beneath these successes lay an unspoken weight. The psychological, another problems that we see is a psychological trauma that remain largely undiagnosed and untreated, right? You often hear about PTSD, right, with American soldiers coming home from. Rarely ever do you hear this word within the Vietnamese community. It's either not addressed, it's either ignored, it's either hidden. But to this very day, it's still undiagnosed and untreated. People of my parents' generation, for example. Many bore the invisible scars of re-education camps, of all these ordeals, right? And for the second generation, those of the 1.5 and second, third generation, they have to face the trauma of those who has this identity with their ancestor and their ancestors' experiences, but they now have to deal with the reality of assimilating, of being America in America. And the questioning always of, are you American enough, or are you losing your roots? So despite these challenges and the loss of many along the way, the Vietnamese diaspora stands as a testament to survival and resilience. From the bustling markets of Little Saigon to the cultural enclaves of Paris and Melbourne, Vietnamese community have preserved their heritage while also integrating into their new homeland, Pho and bánh mì, as I said, have become globally recognized symbols of Vietnamese rich culinary tradition. And these are, you can make an argument through the works and through the efforts of Vietnamese diaspora. But of course, now they have been, in a way, appropriated by those within the Vietnam and the Vietnamese state, as though pho and bánh mì became famous because of the Vietnamese state. And that is something to be careful with when you look at cultural products and understanding the deep history that resonate behind it and the conflicts behind it. So that's why when you go around, you travel around to Little Saigon and you see a pho 54, ask yourself, why pho 54? You see a pho 79, ask yourself, why pho 79? Well, 54 reminds them of 1954 when the country would be divided in half and those in the north brought pho down. And when they came to America, they opened a shop called Pho 54 as a reminder of their past. Pho 79 is a reminder of that journey in 1979, right? So sitting there eating a bowl of pho is a lesson for all of us to understand those around us, the history, the deep history in which we are connected with through the food and through the cultural product that which we consume. And there's a lot, but I just want to go to the end here. The war. So I just want to finish off. I probably have just 5 minutes, okay? 2, 1? He's not taking, I don't care. Anyways. So we're talking about the diaspora, and the diaspora has a lot to do with the war. But not just the war. It has to do with a lot with the past that is often situated or erased because of the war. So, yet, for many in the diaspora and how we see them, how we interpret them to this very day still remain contested. In official Vietnamese historiography, April 30th, in 2 months' time, right, is known as a day of triumph. The Republic of Vietnam is dismantled, is dismissed as puppet regime. In Vietnamese, it's called Nguy Quân, Nguy Quyền. And their history, as a result, erased in Vietnam. In Vietnam, you can't even mention the Republic of Vietnam by their name. You can't even have pictures of the flags associated with it. So essentially, they're erased. I didn't know about my father being in prison for 7 years until I came to America. Haven't been educated in Vietnam haven't lived in Vietnam for 9 years. That is history erased. The dominant American-centric view of the war and of the diaspora is little different. But for the diaspora, the war was neither an anti-American struggle, as the Vietnamese government often portray, or is merely a Cold War conflict. It is for them, at least from their interpretation, an invasive civil war, the loss of a nation, the collapse of a flawed but aspiring independent democracy. April 30th is not a day for them of reunification, but of mourning. That's why they call that day Black April, as a day of mourning, marking the fall of the Republic and the scattering of their people. Today, the fall of the Republic is also seen not just as the end, but also, you can make an argument, also the beginning of a new identity, as these people in the diaspora forged their own identity. Reconciliation, then, for these people, given all that they have been through, remain elusive. The Vietnamese government has rebranded them, despite the Vietnamese government has rebranding them from being reactionary traitors, Việt Giang phản động, to what they often refer to their diaspora right now as patriotic overseas Vietnamese, Việt kiều yêu nước. Right? The same person changed over time. Why? Because they recognize that these people now have economic value but never recognized their dignity, never recognized their legitimacy, simply the legitimacy to exist under a different regime. So Vietnamese refugees, often those in the first generation, reconciliation is impossible without acknowledgement. For the Vietnamese government, they kept on using the phrase of, let's close these chapters of history and move forward. For the Vietnamese diaspora is, how can we close this chapter when you don't even recognize my existence? What chapter to be closed? There's no reconciliation if the wounds, the undenial is too wide, too hurtful to be healed. I'd like to just end that with saying that Vietnam has changed significantly since 1975. For many of you who get to travel to Vietnam, what you see now are sometimes even better than in America. If you go to bars, clubs in Saigon, Hanoi, Da Nang, right? If you eat the food there, it's probably much better, cheaper. But don't let that lie to you in terms of how the reality was and still is to this very day. As journalists, as religious leaders who spoke up against the regimes are being imprisoned each and every day. So, for those who lost everything, the refugees, the past remained inescapable and irreconcilable, even for those who long to forget it. And the reason why I want to say this is this. I have a brother in which I can stand here and tell you guys all these with confidence. Every time I try to mention anything in the past before we come to America, any story relating to it, he said, I only have one request for you, Thai. I know you're a historian. I know you like to look at those pictures when we were at refugee camps. But please don't ever share those stories on our Viber, because I don't want to remember it anymore. Even for someone who doesn't want to remember it anymore, still has to live with it. It endures, not just in history books and memoirs, but in refugee camps, in languages lost and relearned, and in the quiet grift of those who survive while loved ones perish, and in the relentless, haunting nightmares that continues for many of our parents' generation that don't share with us. It lingers in the stories passed down, the cinematics, footages and frames that you see on HBO, the photographs that remains of the iconic ones by AP and National Geographic, and even the whisper names of remembrance. The Vietnam War was not merely fought twice, as often populated by the author Viet Thanh Nguyen. That is, it's not just fought in the battlefield or in memory, but it's waged, for me, endlessly in various forms. On the battlefield, certainly. Within the body, for those who still to this very day are crippled because of bombs, of bullets. In exile, in memory, certainly, and in the experiences of people who live with it, even in the subconscious state of dreams and nightmares. And among the contested narratives in which we, as intellectual debates in classes, as individual communities, as well as nations, choose to tell, to accept, or even to reject, as well as in the right to be acknowledged, remember, and even forgotten. War does not end with the ceasefire, that is 1975 or 1973. The physical, emotional, and societal impacts echo across generations as well as borders, shaping individuals and communities long after the last shot has been fired. The Vietnamese diaspora scattered across the continent became a living testament to this resilience, this loss, but this sense of renewal too. Their stories are not mere remnants of the past, but also an urgent reminders of war's enduring cost for us to reflect and see the consequences of war in other places. So in many ways, Why does this matter? Because for the Vietnamese refugees experience, it is something that is inseparable from how they remember, interpret, and narrate modern Vietnamese history. That is the Vietnam War, the journey to foreign land, as well as life in exile. For these people, and for these events and our perception as scholars, our perception of them continue to shape our understanding of history and our present reality, whether we acknowledge it or not. So to truly understand modern Vietnamese history, or to truly understand Vietnam or the Vietnam War, we must, and especially the Vietnamese diaspora, we must look beyond. That is, go back and look to when before the war ended and ask these people what were their aspirations, what were their dreams, what were they fighting for, what were they struggling for, and then examine the background, the stories in which led them to flee the nation. And therefore, the Vietnam War is not an isolated conflict neatly sealed within a fixed timeline that we often, for example, many scholars, when they look at the diaspora, they like to start from 1975 to now, never look back. And then for those who study the Vietnam War, often end at 1975 and never look forward. And I think there is somewhere between that we need to expand the way in which we look at historical events. They are not neatly sealed within fixed timeline or in the confines of history books. It remains a story still being written and lived by people, shaped by those who refuse to let it fade. Thank you. I think I took too much time.
Okay, that's good. Thank you. Okay. So we were just talking before we started here about the order of which people would present, and I was wondering if I should, be second or third, or we were considering that. Finally, Alec decided that second would be best, and I think it was a good decision, because I'm going to, in some ways, not tell the same story as we just heard, although it was a wonderful story that you told, but something that has some parallels that relate to Laos, okay? A country that I've spent a lot of time with. I've both lived in Laos for many years, 15 years in Laos, but I also spent a lot of time with the Lao diaspora in Canada, France, and the United States over the last 20 years or so. So I'm going to tell a story, and I'm also going to go between the past, the pre-75 period, and link that more to the post-75 period a little bit. And I'm going to talk about a particular individual. Oh, somehow the formatting has changed a little bit here. Okay. But anyway, I'm going to talk about a man named Captain Gong Lair, or later on was General Gong Lair. You may have heard of him. He's not very well known now, but he is one of the more important historical figures in Laos. And mainly he was a captain, a paratrooper from Sawanakhet in southern Laos. And what he's most known for is on August 10th, 1960, he orchestrated a successful military coup in Laos, took over the government in Vientiane. It was in the name of neutralism. He was somebody who advocated for not having either the left or the right in Laos. He wanted Laos to be a neutral country, and he was sort of one of the important representatives of that. And it was a very popular coup at the time that it occurred. And a lot of young people rose up and were very happy about this coup to try to get rid of both what they saw as foreign interferers from other countries. And it didn't last long. He was only able to hold control there for 4 or 5 months. By December 1960, with the support of the United States and Thailand, a group of resistors came up from southern Laos and retook Vientiane from Gong Lê. And Gong Lê was forced to flee with his forces to the north, to Quang Vieng, and later to the plain of Jars, where he became aligned with the communist Pathet Lao at that time, against the right wing that had retaken Vientiane. However, that alliance with the Pathet Lao, or the communists in Laos, did not last long. And by April 1963, the neutralists had split into 2 camps. One camp had called themselves the Patriotic Neutralists, and they had joined with the communist Pathet Lao. And the other, led by Gong Lê, had returned and become aligned again with the Royal Lao government. And he had returned to Vientiane, and he became a general at that point, and was the head of the neutralist forces that were in Laos at that time. And his forces did suffer some military defeats against the communists in the 1960s, including Vietnamese that were supporting the Pathet Lao. They were actually the main fighting force in Laos. It wasn't actually the Lao as much as the Vietnamese at that time. But eventually he had problems with others in the Royal Lao government, and he was forced to flee the country in October 1966. And he became a refugee in Indonesia. And like I said, the formatting's changed here. Below here it says France. Later on, he eventually went to France and ended up there. There is him in 1977 in France talking to other Lao refugees who had arrived there. And soon after, after 75 came and the government changed in Laos, and he was a political refugee in France at that time, and he was one of the first because he'd arrived much earlier than other political refugees, he set up a movement called, the acronym is More Plan. You can see the full name of it there in French. I won't say it since my pronunciation in French might not be adequate. But anyway, that was established in 1976 as a resistance organization against the new government in Laos, the communist government in Laos. And he was supported in setting up this organization by a fellow named Jean Douve, who was, again, they've cut off the top here, but anyway, he had been the commander of the police in Laos before 1954, and he had also given Gong Lê advice in 1960 about conducting the coup that happened then. And later he encouraged Gong Lê to establish More Plan in 1976. Now, at the same time, as he was setting this up, there were increasing numbers of Lao people coming from Laos as political refugees to France. One of them was, again, they've cut the top off here, but the formatting seems to have changed. But this guy is named Tanom Sok Noi. He had been a teacher at Dong Duc University in Vientiane, but in 1974 he had a conflict with some of his colleagues, and he had fled to France due to this conflict. And so he was there earlier again than most. He met with Gong Lê early on and became a close ally of Gong Lê at that time. There was another man named Sulang Det Wong Sa, who was a former teacher, also in Vientiane, and his wife. They had also arrived in France in 1975 as political refugees. And these were sort of the main sort of intellectual grouping of people that established More Plan. Now, what's interesting was, as More Plan was getting going politically, they were organizing themselves, and they were already beginning to send some aid, as little as they had, as new refugees. They didn't have a lot of money, but small amounts that they said they were sending it to some resistance groups that were operating in Laos and along the border between Thailand and Laos. The Chinese took notice of this. And remember, the Chinese already knew who Gong Lê was from 1960. He was already a well-known figure, and he was known to be a neutralist at that time. And the neutralists had, in the pre-1975 period, had a number of interactions with the Chinese government, including, if you look at Nick Zeller's PhD, he talks a lot about neutralist delegations going to China in the 1960s. And so anyway, the Chinese took note, and in 1978, they sent an operant named Singh from Hong Kong to Paris, and he made contact with Morplan. And he was a Chinese Lao who had lived in Laos prior to 75 and had worked as a Chinese spy for the Chinese government at that time. And later, after 75, he had left, he'd gone to Hong Kong, and then the Chinese sent him to Paris to make contact with Morplan. After a few months of working together, all of a sudden, Gong Lair was advised to travel to Zurich in Switzerland, and there was an airplane waiting there for him, a 747, and he flew to Beijing in the 747. He was the only passenger on the airplane, a 747 with one passenger. But he was clearly an important figure for them. This was following the 1-month war between China and Vietnam that had occurred in February '79. And the Chinese were wanting to make trouble for Vietnam. And Vietnam was very closely aligned with Laos. Laos had sided with Vietnam very closely. There was a lot of Vietnamese soldiers and government officials still in Laos. Many perceived Laos as a puppet government of Vietnam. So they wanted to destabilize the situation there with the Vietnamese. So they thought that Gong Lair could be their person to do that. So he was brought to Beijing, and then he made contact with other people on the border of Thailand and Laos who were already organizing politically, who had already been organizing since '75 against the Lao government, and they started providing support. And on May 23rd, on the day that he was flying out of Zurich, and he was not allowed to tell any of his fellow members that he was leaving for China. He was held to strict secrecy, and he only was able to write a letter to them and inform them that he was getting on the plane. And of course, the letter would not have arrived to them until after he was already in China. He wrote in on May 23rd, as just before he left on the plane, he says, "We have achieved 90% so far, and once I arrive in Beijing, it will be 100%. So he was obviously very encouraged about Chinese support and what might this lead to in terms of liberating Laos from communism. And so he arrived there, and he brought the leaders of the insurgent groups along the border, were also walked up across Laos into China. This is a grouping of them. You see Gong Lair in the middle there. There are Eomian or Yao, ethnic minorities who were insurgents beside him there. Down below here is an ethnic Khmu insurgent leader, and they had all arrived in China and met in Beijing. This was the beginning of their support. Now, I was fortunate in that I was able to, when I was doing research on this topic in France, I met Tanam Sok Noi. I also managed to meet Gong Lair and interview him. I actually did a 6-hour interview with him at that time. And I met Tanam Sok Noi, and he had a set of letters which Gong Lair had sent to him between 1979 and 1983 when he was in China. And he had sent him all these letters. Many of them were very long letters. Some of them were 20 or 25 pages long, handwritten in Lao. And he had saved them all. And he made photocopies of all these letters, a pack of letters like this, and gave them to me. And this is a great historical record of what was going on at that time. So I won't be able to get into all that detail. In the paper that I've written, there's a lot more detail, but I'm just going to go over the overall story here. But essentially, this set of letters helps to verify what kind of happened at that time. This is them with their Chinese minders. And this is Gong Lair with Jan Suk, the Khmu leader. And note that they were, dressing in Maoist uniforms. They were, it was a very secret operation. They were not supposed to identify themselves as having come from Laos. This was a very secret operation, even up to now. I think this is the first time anybody's presented on it. Then later on, Gong Lair was sent down to Yunnan province, near the border with Laos, where a large number of insurgents had come up from Laos, entered into China via Laos. Sometimes it took them weeks or even a month to walk through Laos to get to China. Then they were provided with training and arms and supplies and sent back to Laos to fight against the communists, including especially the Vietnamese. There's Gong Lair meeting some farmer in Yunnan. And then Gong Lair himself had a headquarters base back in Beijing. So then he's back in Beijing. Everywhere he went, he had these Chinese minders that went with him to ensure his security, but also, I'm sure, to keep a close eye on what he was doing. So this was a highly sort of organized operation. At the same time, Gong Lair was contacting other Lao refugees, including his relatives, some of whom were in the United States. They also joined him in China, some of them, to support his efforts in the early 1980s. There's Gong Lair with two men from the United States that were his sort of representatives there. And there they are in Beijing at a restaurant in 1983. Now, the support that they were receiving, the arms, supplies, and other support, went to various insurgents groups. So, for example, one of his main men on the ground was Kambu, Colonel Kambu Pimasen in Sawanakhet province, who had he had been a colonel in the Royal Lao Army, in the neutralist branch of the Royal Lao Army previously. He had a whole group of insurgents in Sawanakhet province. Here's a photograph of them in Sawanakhet, who they'd already been receiving some small support beginning in '76 from France. But once the Chinese got involved, that increased a lot. The arms came two ways. They came from the north, from China, with the insurgents in the north, and those in the south, like Sawanakhet, came from the south via the Khmer Rouge. So the Khmer Rouge received arms with the agreement of Thailand to pass through to the Khmer Rouge, and then the Khmer Rouge used some of those arms themselves, and some of them they distributed to the Lao insurgents in southern Laos, so that those insurgents in southern Laos could also act as a buffer in case the Vietnamese in Laos would attack the Khmer Rouge from the north, from Laos. So it was a coordinated effort. Colonel Kambu had quite a large group, and he got a lot of villager support. This is a photo of Kambu's soldiers helping villagers to harvest rice. So they were out there working with villagers, helping them to harvest rice, providing them with medical support, doing other things to try to win the hearts and minds of local people. Meanwhile, in the north, these are Khmer insurgents who were trained. This is in China. Later, they returned to Laos and were involved in various activities there. Now, in the meantime, in 1981, and again, the top's cut off here, so don't pay too much attention to the writing. The gentleman here is named Dr. Kamseng Gale Sensatit, and he had been a high-level Lao official prior to 1981, and in 81, he chose to defect to China. He was the highest level defector at that time, and when he got there, he joined up with a group of Lao in France who had set up what they had called the Lao Socialist Party. And this was essentially the socialist alternative to the Pathet Lao, a pro-Chinese socialist regime that they wanted to have. And so Dr. Kamseng Gale was very popular amongst the Chinese government because he was a communist, but he was not pro-Pathet Lao, which is what they liked. And so he started having his own military group, military people, and they were also involved in the insurgency. Now, finally, in 1983, there was a conflict between Gong Le and the Chinese. Basically, what happened was that the Chinese wanted Dr. Kamseng-Gale to sort of take the lead because he was more ideologically aligned to them, and wanted Gong Le to come under Dr. Kamseng-Gale. But Gong Le said, probably too openly to the Chinese, he said, here we are, we're fighting against communism, and you want me to come under a communist? And that obviously didn't go over well with the Chinese, and they basically expelled him. So Gong Le had to leave, returning to France in 1983. This is a photograph of the two major insurgents in northern Laos that were under his grouping, neutralists. One is the Yao or Iomian guy on the left, Seng Fu, and then Jun Suk was on the right-hand side. This is a picture of them in the forest in Laos after they were told that the Chinese would no longer be supporting them, and they're signing an agreement and shaking hands saying, we will continue to fight even without Chinese support. We're not going to stop. So this is them affirming that they were not going to give up the fight even though Chinese had decided not to support them anymore. And they did continue. Jun Suk continued up to 1990 when he finally stopped, and some of his underlings actually continued on up to about 2003. So this was a long-term operation, and they were happy to receive Chinese support, but they were not operating for the Chinese. They were operating for themselves with whatever support anybody would give them. Now, Gong Le himself also did not stop his political activities, and he determined that the best place to potentially get more political support was the United States. And so in 1988, he came to the United States, and he had a lot of supporters there in the United States, a lot of neutralist supporters. When they met regular Americans, they would tell them that they were right-wing, but they were actually neutralists. And this is a Basi ceremony that was done in the late 1980s in Richmond, California, where Gong Le was visiting at that time. And these were former soldiers that had worked with him back in the 1960s. And he was there from 1988 to 1995. And these sort of meetings were organized all over the United States and Canada. This is another group of neutralists, Gong Le in the middle there, meeting to talk about political organizing against the communist government in Laos. And so he had a lot of supporters. He traveled from city to city. Every city had Lao supporters of his there, and they would come to meet him, and they were fundraising, doing parties and things to raise fund. Some of that money was sent to people who were still fighting inside Laos at that time. So this was, clearly the war did not end in 1975, just as we heard from our previous speaker. And the geography was a bit different than the case of Vietnam. So in Vietnam, I'm sure that the Vietnamese in the United States would have been involved in similar types of military operations in Vietnam if they could have. But they couldn't, because the countries adjacent to Vietnam were Cambodia and Laos, who were both communist countries at that time. But in the case of Laos, they were able to set up camps and operations in Thailand, adjacent to Laos, because the Thai government was very worried about a Vietnamese invasion of Thailand. Thailand was supposed to be the next domino that fell, according to the old domino theory. They were concerned. They knew that the Vietnamese military was much more powerful than the Thai military. They could have easily taken Thailand. And in fact, the story goes that the Vietnamese government actually did offer to take Thailand in about 1979. But oddly enough, the people that persuaded them to not do it was the Communist Party of Thailand. The Communist Party of Thailand said to the Vietnamese, no, we don't want you to do this because that will reinforce the propaganda that's always said that we in the Communist Party of Thailand are not actually Thais. It would reinforce that narrative, and we don't want to. We want to take Thailand, but we want to do it ourselves. And Thank you very much, but we're not going to take your support. So meanwhile, the Thais they weren't directly arming the Lao insurgency, but they allowed them to put up camps inside Thailand, and they got the Lao to collect military intelligence inside Laos, and they were also supposed to operate as a buffer in case the Vietnamese ever did try to invade through Laos, Thailand. So this was what was, this was all that was going on at that time. Coming back to Gong Le, he went on in, this is kind of a funny story because, considering the political times that we're in now, but finally Gong Le, he was in the U.S. He had visa trouble. He had visa troubles in the U.S. His visa ran out, and he didn't get it extended properly, or he didn't know what he was doing, or something like that. And he had no visa at a certain point. So he wasn't sure what to do about it. And finally, his supporters said, "Let's sneak him to Mexico, and make him and say that he's a Mexican." Because he's Lao, he looks kind of like a Mexican, and made him out to be a Mexican. And he snuck across the border with no passport into Mexico. And then from there, they were able to get him some kind of fake Mexican passport. And then eventually, he was able to fly to Malaysia. And then he ended up spending about a decade on the Malaysia-Thailand border without any real documentation. And then finally, some of his supporters were able to get him into Thailand, and eventually they were able to get him back to France in November 2005. I met him in 2009 in Paris. He was living in public housing in a very kind of rough neighborhood, actually his minders. He had some supporters there in France who he initially agreed to meet with me over the phone, and then his minders had determined that it was too dangerous to meet me. So they tried to block me to meet him, but the day came, and I couldn't contact my phone, nobody was answering the phone, but he had already told me his address. So I just went there, and got there, knocked on the door, and I hear this behind the door, and speaking in Lao, "Who is it? Who is it?" And I said, and I answered him in Lao. I said, it's me. And then he opened the door. He was by himself. And then he let me in, and I started interviewing him. His minders showed up about 3 hours later. And then they came in. They were just shocked to see me sitting there. But they realized at that point that I wasn't going to assassinate him. And so anyway, I had a good interview with him. And then finally, when I first showed up, he wasn't even wearing a shirt. He was sort of just in short pants it was in the summertime. He wasn't formal. But then when I asked to take his photograph, he said, "Well, I got to get dressed up first." So there he is. He dressed up with his tie and shirt on for this photograph. Finally, he passed away in 2014. So anyway, the point is that, to understand, you can understand from this story, right, that the war did not end in 75. It may have ended earlier than that in a lot of Americans' point of view, but for those people that were from Laos, it did not end then. And even up to now, you can go to any city in the United States and find Lao people who will refuse to go back to Laos. I mean, the big fight now is between those who agree to go back to visit and those who refuse to go. And I'm sure it's the same in the Vietnamese community. This is people don't understand and many feel betrayed, right? They feel betrayed by the United States, for leaving them and not supporting them, despite the support that they provided at that time. Although they're also grateful to being able to come to the U.S. So I'll leave it at that, but hopefully that will give you a sense of part of the way that the Lao people understand things.
Sorry about that. Powerful. I don't know what happened there. I don't know what happened there.
I think it's a new version. I have a new version. It's an old.
right, thank you. Maybe folks need a bio break, but the show will go on. Okay, I'm Sophal Ear. Thank you so much for joining us today. I want to first of all thank Alec Holcomb for inviting me to be here, and Cameron Dunbar for doing all the logistics, and Cody for chairing this panel. The country that I'm covering is Cambodia, and this picture here is an AI-generated picture that I instructed ChatGPT to make for this presentation. And it took a bit of work because the first version was this, and I was, I said, can you generate a widescreen 16:9 image I can use for PowerPoint title slide of my talk? And here's the title. And then there were these buildings in the back, and I thought, this is not consistent. Let's keep working on it. I then told it to, I said, the Khmer Rouge normally wear black pajama uniforms, and then it came up with this version. And I'm like, but where are the pajama uniforms? Anyhow, it just keeps going and going. And so finally we get to this version, and that's the one that I decided, well, I can't keep massaging ChatGPT to make more images, so let's just stick with this. So why am I interested in Cambodia? Well, I'm originally from Cambodia. I was born there in '74. My family's escape I spoke about it on the TED stage, and it's my mother's story of cunning and determination in getting her 5 kids out of Cambodia during the Khmer Rouge. And it was delivered in 2009 when she had the chance to be there. Of course, TED does that. They bring the mom as a prop. So there she is, and getting her standing ovation. My wife, pregnant with our firstborn, sitting next to her. And of course, this being TED, there's always somebody big in the audience that I didn't recognize at that point, but then later found out was there. So 6 months later, Mom passes away, and I have to think about all of the lessons of her life, some of that legacy, some of the questions, and just the wisdom she imparted. And in the first book that I wrote, 8 Dependents in Cambodia, I had the chance to tell some of that in there. But just as the first panelist, Alex, was more reflective, this talk is a bit more personal, obviously, and it's certainly the story of how the war didn't end in '75. Actually, for Cambodia, it had begun from '65, and it continued on to '75, and then we thought it was going to end in '75 when the Khmer Rouge won, but actually it was not the end, it was just the beginning. So here, 1969, Mom and Dad, in what is relatively a peaceful Cambodia, and our home, really a mansion that is today occupied by a dozen families. I had the chance to visit it a few years ago. Cambodia itself was known as the Pearl of Asia and an island of peace. And to prove the point, Lee Kuan Yew here, the founding father of Singapore, right after the expulsion of Singapore from the Union of Malaya, and he suddenly got the city-state that he has to defend against neighboring countries, visits Cambodia and embraces Prince Sihanouk, head of state, to learn the lessons of nation building from Sihanouk. So Cambodia at that point was certainly a place where these architectural delights could be found. The movies of the prince himself, here a screening of Le Petit Prince, but his version of it, where he's the hero, of course. He was an artist. He loved to make movies, and across the world, of course, President Nixon was pointing to Cambodia by 1970, April 30th there, and talking about U.S. incursions into Cambodia, for which by 1971 he said there are no American combat troops in Cambodia. There are no American combat troops in Cambodia. There are no American combat advisors in Cambodia. There will be no American combat troops or advisors in Cambodia. We will aid Cambodia. Cambodia is the Nixon doctrine in its purest form. Now, of course, this is very elliptical language that doesn't actually define what the Nixon doctrine is. So when I've asked my students, what do you think the Nixon doctrine means? They'll talk about trade and foreign aid and all the wonderful things that they think a doctrine should mean. But we can see from the map here that basically what he was referring to was the fact that the Ho Chi Minh Trail cut a swath across Cambodia and allowed the Viet Cong to get resupplied behind on the soil of another country that was not officially at war with the United States. So then, they can't technically go there. But what did this really mean in terms of the Nixon Doctrine? And of course, it meant B-52s would be dropping their payload on Cambodia. And while I debated whether to keep this slide in, I think it does send a message about what it all comes down to in the end. In Cambodia, at least, 113,000 sites were bombed from 63 to some 65 to 73. Now, tonnage equivalent, one can debate whether it's more than World War II Europe combined, more than Hiroshima and Nagasaki in terms of tonnage equivalent. But the end result, and of course by then, in 1970, Sihanouk is deposed in a coup and runs off to Beijing and aligns himself with the movement that is the Khmer Rouge. He doesn't call them the Khmer Rouge from that point onwards. He's simply this coalition government that he wants to create, this sort of rebel movement that wants to retake Cambodia from the Republicans, who, of course, were backed by the U.S. and had taken over and turned the country into the Khmer Republic. But by 1975, April 17th, Phnom Penh falls to the Khmer Rouge. And it's actually not a time where people are thinking, oh my God, it's the end of the world, but rather, oh my goodness, it's finally the end of the war. People are jubilant because they think things can't get worse, except they will. And the teenagers who take over Phnom Penh are, kids that would be probably undergrads at Ohio. They're just young people brainwashed to believe that this movement is cleaning out the cities and removing the parasites of the bourgeoisie who have been using, consuming, but not producing. And that image there on the poster is the same image here on your screen, which actually is not a Khmer Rouge guy. It's a guy who thought he was going to take over the country that day. But the 2 million people who lived in Phnom Penh, families like my own, had to be evacuated. And the basis of the rationale was, of course, that the U.S. bombs were going to be dropped. And so for their safety, they needed to evacuate for a few days, just for a few days, and then they'd be allowed to return, except it was, of course, a ruse. And so in this mass exodus, families like my own were sent out to the countryside to work in labor camps and in work camps and rice growing fields and so on. So Pol Pot is, pictured here on the left. He's basically, it's hard to describe what kind of regime Cambodia was during the period of democratic Kampuchea, the period in which the Khmer Rouge had power. The words of Michael Paternity ring here, I think, truest in that, he says, once upon a time there was a regime so evil that it created an anti-society where torture was currency and music, books, and love were abolished. This regime ruled for 4 years and murdered nearly 2 million of its citizens, a quarter of the population, which I understand. If you have heard of Stalin's dictum about, the death of one man is a tragedy to the world, but the death of 1 million is a statistic, it really becomes a statistic when one looks at 2 million deaths. Even at 1/4, 1 out of 4 people, it's hard to imagine or understand what it all boils down to. So, there's a genocide museum, which used to be a torture center, which was originally a high school called Tuol Sleng S21, where up to 16,000 people were tortured to death. It's behind barbed wires in classrooms or offices turned into torture chambers using medieval-looking, devices, which, by the way, when I've spoken to audiences where, people have, stayed in Evan prison in Tehran, for example, they've said, oh, it's all pretty much the same stuff. They all use the same equipment. But the Khmer Rouge at S21 were particularly fascinated with documenting who came in. So pictures were taken of everyone that came in. And so mothers with their infants, babies, all accused of being enemies of the people, a phrase we've heard more recently. Children, tagged for elimination, confessing of being both KGB and CIA simultaneously, because after all, the enemy of the Khmer Rouge is, it's the Soviet Union and the United States, right? So because they're backed by the Chinese. And so they end up, of course, in killing fields. S-21, as I mentioned, had over 16,000 detainees. Fewer than a dozen survived. This is according to the Documentation Center of Cambodia. Systematic purges of intellectuals, ethnic minorities, former officials, and suspected dissidents. I mean, people who wore glasses were eliminated for plausibly being able to read. Bodies buried in over 20,000 mass graves across Cambodia. And so you have a situation in which Cambodia's fall Cambodia after Saigon's fall is really a trajectory from the Khmer Rouge to the Vietnamese intervention in 1979 and Cold War geopolitics. And this decade was shaped by genocide, foreign occupation, economic devastation, and global superpower struggles. That year zero, which you see here by François Ponchot, who recently passed away, incidentally, Père Ponchot, was the first book that really brought to bear the crimes of the Khmer Rouge. I mean, his ability to put into words what they were up to. Pol Pot's forces seized Phnom Penh. All urban residents were forcibly evacuated, as I mentioned, to the countryside, and there was the abolition of money. The central bank was blown up. Markets, private property were all eliminated in an attempt to create classless agrarian society. And the population was forced into these collective farms, leading to widespread malnutrition and forced labor. And when Alex was talking about the new economic life, actually, my own family was faced with that when we did end up escaping to Vietnam, pretending to be Vietnamese, because the choice was you're going to end up in the new economic life, or you better get family to come rescue you. Thankfully, we had family to come rescue us, but that would have been no better than really the Khmer Rouge. Rice production targets by the Khmer Rouge were unreasonably high. I mean, they just thought production is going to be incredible, so they expected 3 tons per hectare. The reality was more like 1 ton per hectare. Trade with foreign nations was banned. It was total economic isolation, and currency was abolished. There was a barter system, if you could allow one, but it failed, leading to famine. Then you have the Khmer Rouge starting to launch attacks, cross-border attacks on the Vietnamese. This is actually a Vietnamese soldier on a Vietnamese tank. But in January 7th, 1979, Phnom Penh falls to the Vietnamese-backed Cambodian forces led by Heng Samrin, and the Khmer Rouge retreat to the Thai border while receiving backing from China, the United States, you heard that right, and ASEAN, despite past atrocities. Because again, the enemy of your enemy is your friend. So who is the US opposed to? The Soviet Union. Who is the client state of the Soviet Union? The Vietnamese. And what have they invaded? Cambodia. So we're opposed to that. During this period of time, the People's Republic of Kampuchea, which is the new name of Cambodia under the Vietnamese occupiers, is installed, this PRK, and it's led by, again, this Heng Samrin, ex-Khmer Rouge defector, and along with 200,000 Vietnamese troops that remain in Cambodia for the decade of 79 to 89. And really, it's fascinating to think about how the PRK, the People's Republic of Kampuchea, was really recognized only by Vietnam, the Soviet Union, and Eastern Bloc countries. Western nations, again, ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, China, continue recognizing the Khmer Rouge as Cambodia's official government. And so the UN seat for Cambodia is occupied by the coalition government of Democratic Kampuchea, which includes the Khmer Rouge and is backed by the United States. So China provides about $1 billion in aid to the Khmer Rouge post-79. There's U.S. covert funding to the tune of about $85 million to the anti-Vietnamese resistance, and the Soviet Union supplies military and economic aid to the People's Republic of Kampuchea. Cuba, East Germany provide advisors. There were over 600,000 Cambodians who fled to the Thai border at that time, including my wife's family. Some camps were controlled by armed forces, armed factions, including the Khmer Rouge remnants. So it was like the luck of the draw. If you end up in the wrong camp, you end up back with the Khmer Rouge controlling that camp. There was limited humanitarian aid because of the Cold War politics and the US and ASEAN prioritizing support for the anti-People's Republic of Kampuchea forces. So books like Eva Mislevich's Punishing the Poor, The International Isolation of Kampuchea, advocated, of course, for a different stance, for aiding the People's Republic of Kampuchea. But the country itself, the regime itself didn't help itself when, of course, it introduced a state-controlled economy. It had agricultural production that was still weak. And finally, by 1980, they reintroduced currency, but it suffered from hyperinflation. There was a heavy reliance on Vietnamese and Soviet subsidies during this time. The guy who, of course, became 38-year running prime minister, Hun Sen, assumes power by 1985, which I understand is the end period of what we're looking at today, but or during this conference. But he becomes prime minister at age 33, and there are these Vietnamese-backed, he's Vietnamese-backed, but begins diplomatic overtures to the West by the late 1980s. And by 88, he says this, he writes this: China is the root of all evil in Cambodia. Mark those words. The Khmer Rouge legacy still affects Cambodia's politics and justice system to this day. International development and involvement is, prolonged Cambodia's suffering in some ways rather than alleviating it. And of course, what I write about is the issue of aid dependence, which persists today, with China now Cambodia's largest donor. Finally, Cambodia remains shaped by Cold War politics and economic dependence. When you look, for example, at the fact that the Prime Minister of 38 years, Hun Sen, is standing there next to his son, Hun Manet, who is now the Prime Minister as of 2023, a West Point graduate. Many hoped he would be more Western-oriented in terms of opening up Cambodia into a new spring, but that has yet to happen. And in fact, a few weeks ago, an opposition guy was assassinated in Bangkok as a kind of signal of the reach of what can happen to people when they oppose the authorities. And here he is, Hun Sen, personally introducing his son, Hun Manet, to Xi Jinping. Again, the same guy who said that China is the root of all that is evil in Cambodia. Realism would, of course, dictate that there are no permanent friends or enemies, only permanent interests. And that's exactly what Cambodia's regime has signaled. The Khmer Rouge radical policies led to genocide and economic collapse during this period of post-war decade. Vietnam's intervention ended the Khmer Rouge regime, the Khmer Rouge control, but triggered global opposition, and those Cold War superpowers used Cambodia as a proxy battleground, deepening its instability. I'll end here. I did ask ChatGPT for an appropriate graphic, but suddenly it put the US Capitol in the background there. Maybe it's a message. I don't know. Thank you.
I was told to keep my talk to 25 minutes, which I will try my best. It's actually the most boring talk that you've heard this afternoon. I don't know how to use ChatGPT. Tuong Vu, University of Oregon, title of my talk, Vietnam 1975-85, the lost decade. And by the last decade, I mean, there's very limited research that has been done about this period. And also, I mean, there was a huge gap between the high expectations at the beginning in 1975 for Vietnam, and the dismal outcomes at the end of the period in 1985. And just on a personal note, I lived through that period as a child. But just for you to get a sense of the high expectations at the beginning, here's the poem, excerpt from a poem by Tuong Vu, written in 1976. And you could read the English translation there. We have one. Let's walk straight ahead. Fill the bomb craters, erase all sorrow. From the ashes, we rebuild our villages, streets, and our souls. I dream again on the Pacific Ocean. Our homeland is like a paradise of millions and heroes who create life of freedom, hope, love. And then this is the second, another poem written to dedicate to the Communist Party of Vietnam when it had this party congress in late 1976. This time I read in Vietnamese. Thời gian không đợi, cả trời đất vào xuân cùng ta đồng khởi. Cho những mùa gặt lớn mai sau phải nhanh chân từ những bước đầu. Tổ quốc ta phải giàu, phải mạnh. Ta sẽ đi như lao vào trận đánh, đường Hồ Chí Minh rộng mở thênh thang. Ta phải thắng thiên nhiên và thắng cả chính mình, cho chủ nghĩa xã hội hoàn toàn thắng lợi. For socialism to be completely victorious. And Tuong Vu was a member of the Politburo, of the Vietnamese Communist Party, and later first deputy prime minister. And he contributed significantly to the tragedies that would happen during this decade. And the tragedies can be traced to three key post-war policies or decisions and the unexpected events that were broadly connected to them. The first one was the decision to reunify the country in 1976 and eradication of the capitalist Southern economy. So for about a year after April 1975, the victory, Hanoi leaders considered the possibility of keeping the South nominally separate from the North as a political entity, just to attract foreign aid and investment. But they eventually abandoned that idea and proceeded to reunify the country in late 1976, and at the same time launch a utopian plan to build socialism in a short time. I believe Vietnamese history would have been very different if they had taken the other path, but that was what they did. And another decision was to imprison for the long term the personnel of the Republic of Vietnam that had surrendered in April 1975 that my colleague Alex talked about earlier. So these three decisions were instrumental. In time, they contributed to a series of unexpected events, the two wars, war with China, war with Cambodia, the Boer people crisis, international isolation, and embargo by the West that caused so much suffering to Vietnamese that my colleague Alex talked about earlier. So these are the questions that have not been fully answered about those decisions or policies. Why not delay reunification? What was the plan for the South future? What was the plan for the vanquished, the surrendered? How well did Hanoi know about Pol Pot's intentions? What was Hanoi's assessment of China as a potential threat? And how much Hanoi was aware of changes in U.S. attitude toward Vietnam after defeat? So these are the questions that, we still know very little. And so because of the lack of, documentary evidence, but I try to, offer some speculation and also a very general explanation for these events. So first, why not delay reunification? And what was the plan for South Vietnam's future? I believe the default plan since before the war, since 1954, was to, after the conquest of South Vietnam, North Vietnam would build a socialist society system, just like in the Soviet Union, right? That's what they did in the North, and that's what they wanted to do it for the South once they've won the victory. And in 1976, Vietnam briefly floated the idea of both the South and the North applying for United Nations membership. But they did not pursue this idea when South Korea heard of it and lobbied the US for the UN membership for both North and South Korea at the same time with North and South Vietnam. So the Vietnamese government decided to abandon that idea. And there was another possible reason for the decision not to delay reunification, which was their fear of losing control of the South if delayed. As we know from the testimonies of some former NLF, National Liberation Front members and leaders, they were losing the trust of Hanoi leaders near the end of the war, in the last years of the war. So that was a possible reason. And finally, Hanoi leaders were proud of their military victory, which consolidated further their belief in Marxist-Leninist ideology and their ability to overcome any possible challenges. So that was, kind of my speculations based on my reading a lot of Vietnamese documents, but nothing kind of, directly about this decision. Now, what was the plan for the vanquished? How to treat them? I believe the default plan was for long-term re-education, understood as slow death by neglect. And the original plan was for lifetime incarceration, to keep them in prison from a faraway place for all personnel from the rank of major up and their equivalents in the government, in the civilian government. So that was the plan, original plan. So that's why in the first kind of 3 or 4 years, the prisoners were not allowed to send any letters home. But then later, the party was forced to change the plan and allow for phased releases due to, first, the Bo people exodus, who brought much international attention to human rights violations in Vietnam. So it was the Bo people who, went to Thailand and Southeast Asia, who was telling various, kind of UN officials about what was happening inside Vietnam. That brought a lot of international criticisms against the Vietnamese government. And the Chinese invasion also made it insecure to keep those large prisons, because these prisoners had been kept in the places very close to the Chinese border before the war. And then so when Chinese forces attacked North Vietnam across the border, there was no other places that were secure to keep them. If they could not have been kept in the South, that would be very dangerous, because that were where they came from, right? And the central Vietnam was kind of narrow piece of land that could not have would have been open to attempts to rescue them from the ocean. So that's why they eventually decided to release them slowly. So the next question, how much did Hanoi know about Pol Pot's true intentions to make trouble for Vietnam? I would argue that Hanoi was vaguely aware, but did not take the Cambodian threat seriously, thanks to Pol Pot's skills in hiding true intentions. And this is the most interesting slide that I have here with that picture. And if you look at that picture, and Pol Pot sitting on the right, and he's so charming, right? It would be hard to, kind of not to believe him, right? He's so charming. He's the most charming guy there in that picture. And Hanoi also had many loyal allies in the among the Cambodian communists, and they were perhaps counting on them to manage the situation. And overall, they could not have imagined that a militarily weaker Cambodia dared to challenge Vietnam. And they could have never really imagined how Cambodians actually felt about Vietnamese. I don't think they really have that sensitivity to that. And my colleague here so far is smiling. I hope you agree. And how did Hanoi assess the Chinese threat? Since 1971, when Mao invited Nixon to China, Hanoi leaders already condemned Mao as a traitor to a world revolution. And they were well aware of Chinese unhappiness with Vietnam and perhaps suspicious of Chinese intention to keep Vietnam divided. But then they were overconfident in Vietnam's prestige and power after victory. And Vo Nguyen Giap said this best, the general Vo Nguyen Giap, he said this best: the Chinese attack violates the independence and sovereignty of a country that has been considered by the entire world to be the symbol of revolutionary heroism, a country that has sacrificed everything for independence and freedom, for the fatherland, for revolution and peace for all the nations of the world, including China. So they were very confident of Vietnamese international prestige and prowess. They did not expect China to dare to attack Vietnam, right? Just like Cambodia. And how was the Vietnamese aware of changes in U.S. attitudes after defeat? I think they lacked understanding of U.S. attitudes, and they were highly suspicious of U.S. efforts to sabotage Vietnam or to restore the Republic of Vietnam. They did not appreciate the differences between President Carter and President Ford or Nixon before him. So when Carter offered normalization of relationship with Vietnam without any precondition, they rejected and demanded war reparations. So they were quite vindicated by their victory, and they thought that the U.S. could be pressured into paying for war reparations. So when Vietnamese leaders made those key decisions during 1975, 1977, they surely hoped for the best, but they did not anticipate the terrible consequences and the high level of social resistance. The bold people, they were resisting by leaving. So millions of Vietnamese fled the country and sparked a huge international crisis. Most cooperatives collapsed in a few years because the peasants, the southern Vietnamese peasants, refused to accept them. And despite $4 billion in Soviet aid, national per capita income fell by 10% in 1980 and returned to the 1976 level only in 1985. So it was truly a lost decade when the national income returned to, it took 10 years to return to the level in 1976. But the harsh legacies were still there in 1988, as you see in the data, with millions malnourished and near starvation. How much time do I have? 10 minutes, wow, that's a lot. So for a long time, the popular view about Vietnamese communists is that they were mere nationalists, like this, from quote from scholar Benedict Anderson in his book, and he was simply saying that, national identity was more important for communists, like Vietnamese or Chinese and so on. Since World War II, every successful revolution has defined itself in national terms: the People's Republic of China, the Socialist Republic of Vietnam, and so forth. And here's some comments from American historians who study Vietnam War or US foreign relations. So they were claiming that Vietnamese communists were actually nationalists, and they were not inspired by Moscow, by the Soviet Union, and so on. So in my book, published a few years ago, I tried to show that they were much more than that. They were much more than, what the common view says about them. And here, based on the book, I want to provide an explanation for the last decade, which is vanguard internationalism, which is the idea that Vietnamese communism was leading world revolution. As you see from that poster, it says the world's imperialists and counter-revolutionaries don't mess with Vietnam. So it's a threat against not invaders, but imperialists all over the world. Stay away from Vietnam. And the idea emerged, I show in my book, the idea emerged around 1968 when communist leaders saw how quickly the US capitulated after the Tet Offensive. We know that, President Johnson declared an end to the pause to the bombing and wanted to start negotiation with Hanoi. And the success, success because it was a huge military loss, right? They lost 80,000 troops in a year, so it was huge military loss. But it was considered a political success. And that success was the result of a decade pursuing a risky militant strategy against the advice of China and the Soviet Union, which were the powerful leaders of the socialist camp. And I'm going to show you a few quotes that express, these I took from documents from Vietnamese communist leaders. So this quote shows a very dismissive attitude toward China by Lê Duẩn, the leader of the Vietnamese Communist Party in 1968. Our 1960 uprising in the South, while Diem was still strong, is something unprecedented in the world. In some big country, this is China, revolutionary forces were focused only on building bases, not daring to do what we did. Our fraternal parties thought what we did was just impossible. Our offensive is based on the forces of workers and peasants under workers' leadership, not just based on peasants. We are totally different from China. So he keeps saying, having this kind of attitude toward China, even though China was a huge communist power that were sending, lots of weapons and helping Vietnam to fight the Americans. The Chinese Revolution was a big event because it brought the core of mankind into socialism, but essentially it was a civil war to solve internal antagonisms in Chinese society. Vietnam is a small country, but our country has become a place that embodies all the fundamental antagonisms of the world, right? So he was very proud that Vietnam was carrying the revolutionary banner, and Vietnam was the place where the largest powers confronted each other. And this is the same from a kind of statement from another leader, Trường Chinh, In 1968, Vietnam is proud of leading the global offensive against imperialism. Another comment that's kind of dismissive of the Soviet Union. So Comrade Ponomarov's speech claimed that the words was going detente thanks to the strength of the Soviet Union and its policy to pursue peace. We believe that the U.S. has been forced to accept detente by offensive strategy of world revolutionary movements, not by some clever policy to pursue peace. So very proud of Vietnamese militant strategy. And I just encountered this information by chance when I was talking to a nuclear scientist in Hanoi. And he confirmed, I've heard the rumors of Vietnam was thinking of developing nuclear weapons at the end of the war, but I never had any document or anything. And I just asked him a question, and it turned out that so Vietnam did not just think about developing nuclear weapons, but they actually had a plan. And they actually spent 4 or 5 years trying to develop nuclear weapons. And so this Dr. Nguyễn Hào Quang, he was the deputy director of Vietnam Atomic Agency, and he was recruited to work in that program for a few years before it was disbanded. And I can go on and on with these quotes showing that Vietnam was very proud of its leadership of the World Revolution. This quote, our victory over imperialist America created conditions for Laotian and Cambodian revolutions to triumph, opening the path to socialism for them. In the history of world proletarian revolution, thus far only the Soviet Union could liberate itself and some other countries in the process. It is a special honor for Vietnam today to have performed that deed. So they were quite ambitious. They were quite proud of their achievements and accomplishments and contribution to world revolution, right? And I believe that vanguard internationalism partially explains the counterproductive policies in the post-war decade, their impatience for radical change, their tendency to rely on violence to achieve their goals, as you see from the presentation by Alex Tai, and their ambition to lead world revolution that contributed to the resentment that China and Cambodia had toward them and leading to the 2 wars against Vietnam. Thank you very much. That's it.
So I'd like to invite the presenters back up to and then we're going to have 2 microphones on each side. If you would like to ask our presenters questions for Q&A, and Meg. You might have to.
Check.
Okay, can everyone hear me now?
Yeah.
Perfect, it's working. My question is predominantly directed to Dr. Baird. First of all, I think all of your presentations were absolutely phenomenal, and thank you so much for coming. I've learned so much. But for Dr. Baird, could you contextualize what China's endgame was, allying with some non-communist ideologue in and allying themselves with a revolutionary to go into Laos? Was that just simply because they were distrustful of Vietnam, or were there some other factors at play?
Okay, good. Well, a little bit of both. So on the one hand, China had always supported the idea of a neutral Laos in the pre-75 period, or even after the first and second Geneva Accords of 54 and 62. So they had, they were against They were against the U.S. involvement there, but they also respected the idea that Laos could be a neutral country. So, and they had had a lot of interactions with the neutralists, from the 1950s and 60s. And so it wasn't that surprising that they would link up with the neutralists. The other thing about that was that they had to find people that were actually, the other part of it, of course, is the main motivation was that they were against the Vietnamese. And, the Laos had strongly supported the Vietnamese, and they honestly believed that they had, they always say, we've had 1,000 years of peaceful relationships with Laos, and now Vietnam has screwed it all up by, basically making Laos into a puppet government. And so they had to find, and initially they had, over 100,000 troops along the border with Laos, and there was a very good chance that they could have invaded Laos at that time. But because things had not gone very well for them in northern Vietnam when they invaded North Vietnam, they probably decided they didn't want to do that because there were a lot of Vietnamese troops in Laos as well, and they were probably worried about what the result might be. So they thought, okay, well then we'll destabilize them. We'll make life so difficult for them that they won't be able to succeed. They're going to regret what they've done. And so they had to find a group or groups that were willing to fight against the Lao government. And there weren't initially, a lot of, socialist groups. Later on, Dr. Kam Seng Gail shows up in '81, but initially there weren't, Gong Lair was maybe, the neutralists were the closest they could get. And they were familiar with them, and they still were holding on to this idea that neutralism would be a good thing for Laos. And so they said, okay, we'll work with them. And so it was a sort of a combination of, in principle, agreeing with neutralism, and also really the main motivation being that they were against Vietnam. And they continued to support that until about '85. After '85, they stopped providing military support. By the end of the '80s, relations improved significantly with Laos. Now, of course, the whole 1980s are a period between, now China will say, oh, we've had, 70 years of uninterrupted excellent relations with Laos. They don't, the 1980s is not spoken of in a, neither the Lao government or the Chinese government wants to discuss what happened in the 1980s. So it's kind of a lost decade there.
Thank you.
Hi there. I have a question for our first presenter. How much did the Vietnamese government cooperate with the orderly departure program?
I think through phases. I think it has to do with something that Professor Tuong also mentioned earlier. The program was established in 1979, right? But the process of carrying it out lasted all the way up to 1997, right? And it goes through phases as it's a bargaining mechanism for the two countries to really also establish relationship and especially in the later 1980s, for example, with the release of like Tuong Vu, Professor Tuong Vu just mentioned, right? The release of re-education camps prisoners, right? As a part of the bargaining for between the two countries in terms of normalizing their slowly marching toward normalizing their relationship. One of supposedly our other speaker who's supposed to be here, Amanda Demmer, really has a great book on this process where she truly discussed this and how the ODP programs was really utilized and viewed, especially utilized by the Vietnamese government in order, right? Everything is part of a negotiation, right? And these programs understand that. I remember, I don't know if this is true or not, but I remember when I was a kid, listening to the radio, listening to BBC and Voice of America was kind of illegal in Vietnam. And my family was the first family in the village to have a radio. And every time my father turned on the radio to listen to programs in 1989 to learn about the ODP program and the HO program, he would hide in his closet and turn it so low so that nobody in the neighborhood would hear it. And I remember he comes out and always talk about the debate between the two countries about 5 years or 3 years, or 1 year, right? Should the prisoners who were held for 5 years, should those who will be allowed to go to America be kept for 1 year or 5 years, right? And I remember this one time he said, maybe they can reach an agreement of 3 years. And indeed, later they reached an agreement of 3 years, probably more complicated than that. But I remember as people from observant like my parents, right, who look out for these events and how they see states negotiate these terms, right? Certainly, that answered.
Dr. Lee?
Bing Lee from Oklahoma. I have 2 questions. First for Professor Tuong Vu, another for Alex. The first question is about the Vietnamese reform in 1986. According to your presentation, wonderful research, but it seems, until 85, pretty much a communist government and internationalist orientation refused to accept the problems and the mistake they made. How that happened a year later, they make big change. Second question for Alex about diaspora, about Vietnamese refugees, immigrants, and experience in the past 50 years. So how they were doing now? They are in America, all over the world. They still Vietnamese, traditional, or Americans, westernized. For 54, for 79, pretty much Vietnamese. Nail salon, that's for America. Crazy rich Asians, wow, that's for everybody. So anything new? Is there any Vietnamese American culture? In the 50 years, anything's not Vietnam, not American, but as a new cultural identity for the diaspora like you and me. Thank you.
Thank you for your questions. So the question is about, why Vietnam reformed like in 1986, just like a year after my presentation ended. And actually, there were 2 people that I talk about, I quoted in my presentation. One was the poet, right? The poet Tuong Vu. He was appointed first deputy prime minister in 1982 in charge of the economy. A poet appointed to be in charge of the economy. That caused a huge problem in 1985 when he led the policy to reform the currency, leading to inflation rate of 800% a year. So the economy was almost destroyed by him, and he was fired after that, which helped to lead to reform. And then Lê Duẩn was the other person I quote in my presentation, the leader. He died in July 1986. So one guy lost his job, the other guy died, and those are one of those main explanations for why reform was able to happen in 1986.
Thank you for that question. It's a very, very interesting question, and I think it's a very difficult question easy when you first hear it, right? But it's actually a very difficult question to answer because it's so complex when you're talking about refugees, immigrants, diaspora in community in terms of different generations. First of all, we have to talk about generation and generational gaps, right? And as well as the but just first of all, the generational gap. So for the past 50 years, you have within the Vietnamese community, at least I can make an argument that we have at 3 to 4 generation now, right? The first generation being those who came in 1975 all the way up to like around the 2000s, right? Those who came and are associated with the former Republic of Vietnam, right? Myself is coined as 1.5 generation, right? Born in Vietnam, came to America when I was at a certain age. My daughter, my son, a second generation. But those who came in the 1980s have sons and daughters who are now in second generation and third generation, even fourth, right? And each generation has their own ways of interpreting their position here in America relative to also their understanding of, let's say, the Vietnam War and Vietnamese history. Certainly the first generation is most attached to Vietnam. They don't necessarily, they watch American news to hear about what's happening with American politics, American happenings all over, but they paid more attention to the events that happens in Vietnam and what is going on in Vietnam, be it human rights, democracy, or election, who's running the government. So they read Vietnamese papers, they watch Vietnamese news, they watch the BBC News Vietnamese, RFA Vietnamese, and whatnot. 1.5 generation like myself are stuck in between. There are those who want to forget and move on completely, like example, like my brother. Not completely, but don't want to mention the past, and they don't worry as much about Vietnam. And then there are people like myself who as much as being an American, I also, because of my work maybe, but pays a lot of attention to Vietnam and everything similar to my parents' generation. And then those of the second, third, and fourth generation, they then have to adopt an identity that they comes out. It's hard for the first generation, second generation to expect them to be Vietnamese, but then they themselves, at the beginning, has a lot of doubt about themselves. But then when they reach 25, 30, they started putting on a long dress. They start celebrating Tet and New Year in their own way, in their American way. So for example, yesterday when I got here, I immediately went to a pho restaurant called Hương Vietnamese restaurant. And I went up there to eat. And then and it didn't taste like the pho that I normally eat when I was raised in Southern California. It's bad, right? Relatively, right? It's murky. Pho soup is supposed to be clear and whatnot. It has cilantro not cut, but not chopped, but strand of cilantro. And I said, like, how do I evaluate this? And I said, and the pho restaurant is run by a father and a daughter. The daughter spoke English like she was born in America, and the father didn't really understand English. The restaurant has been there for 20 years. And for me to come away from that is that bowl of pho is an American bowl of pho, that which you are asking, right? Because it has to, it's still a pho, Vietnamese pho, but it has to adjust itself in order to suit the circumstances and the environment in which it exists, right? So I hope that kind of answered a little bit. Yeah.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Noma from South Africa. I've got 2 questions. The first one is to the rest of the panel, anyone, I suppose. How do the events that have been shared with us this afternoon continue to shape the geopolitics in Southeast Asia? And the second question is to the first panel. I just wanted to get your interpretation of how the non-diaspora interprets the Vietnamese war in America. The non-diaspora, the non-Vietnamese diaspora, like Americans, interpret the Vietnamese war.
All right, well, I'll be quick. Right. So your question is, how do the events, the geopolitics, continue to affect or shape Southeast Asia today? Well, I think when I ended my presentation with the image of the 38-year ruling prime minister introducing his son, the new prime minister, to Xi Jinping, I think the message is still one of, China's involvement in Cambodia, whether in supporting the Khmer Rouge, then, attacking Vietnam, for invading Cambodia. By the way, one says Vietnam invaded Cambodia, but China won Cambodia in the end. It's China that now has Cambodia. And yeah, and the U.S. is still trying to woo Cambodia away from China's claws, and it's maybe there's a little bit of ray of light because there's a resumption of military exercises coming up this year with the U.S., which had been put on hold for a number of years. So is Cambodia still at play? If it isn't at play, the U.S. wouldn't care because it's like it's a lost cause. It's with China. If it's still possible to believe that Cambodia might be swayable, then invest resources in trying to convince Cambodia that there's a middle path, that it doesn't involve only China. But it's hard. I mean, look, China's the biggest investor, biggest donor, and but then this past year, 2024, no new loans were given to Cambodia from China. So a kind of question mark as to its how much it loves Cambodia in 2024. Maybe it doesn't love it as much as it did before. So maybe there's a chance or an opening for somebody else to come in. Somebody else want to try their area?
Way to answer your question was like 20 years ago, or 15 years ago, I was teaching in Hanoi to a class of undergraduate students. I showed a movie called Vượt Sóng, Journey of the Fall. It's about the journey of those who left by boat and come to America. After I showed that movie, which was prohibited in Vietnam, groups of students came up to me, shed their tears, and said, "This is our first time hearing about the story. This is our first time learning of it. We didn't know that you, Viet Kiều, came to America and had to endure all these journeys." In Vietnam, for the past 50 years, education has been controlled. The history of the Republic of Vietnam very much erased. A lot of students don't know that there exists before there was a Republic of Vietnam. There were such flags that represent the Republic of Vietnam, that there were people who left by boat. It is, however, my argument is that through the existence of the Vietnamese diaspora internationally, especially those who left after 75 due to their association with the war, that allows for an alternative to that narrative control within Vietnam. Thus, through the scholarship of scholars like this among us, that allows, with the internet and flow of information, that allows for many in Vietnam to now learn about these stories and have a better understanding of Vietnamese history. I hope that answered your question.
I actually have two questions, if that's okay, Alec. Yeah, one's for Ian and one's for Sophal and Tuong. For Ian, there's this new book out by Ryan Ford that argues that analysis of Lao politicians during the period that you're writing about and earlier characterizes them as agents of outsiders or maybe agents in sort of factional politics, but doesn't really take their ideas seriously and doesn't really consider them people with deeply felt political ideological systems. And he says that his research supports the fact that this has been overlooked, that Lao politicians are actually feel deeply Republican values or they feel deeply the politics they support. So I was just wondering if your research supports this book's argument or not. The second question for Tuong and Sophal is, I could imagine a different group of scholars on a panel about post-war Vietnam and Cambodia, and they would talk a little bit more about the United States. I have heard very little about the U.S. embargo, for example, which I could imagine another panel being all about the effects of the U.S. embargo. And I heard very little about the kind of long-term consequences of U.S. bombing on the character of the Khmer Rouge. I guess I'm curious, neither of you really talked about the U.S. If you were forced to talk about the U.S. in relation to 75 to 86, what would you say about the U.S. role?
Okay, I'll start here. So yeah, in relation to, for those who don't know, Ryan Wolfson Ford has a book out called, what is it, Forsaken, I forget what the name is, so as a sort of disclaimer, I was on Ryan's PhD dissertation committee, and I was the only Lao expert on that committee, so I probably had a lot of influence on that. But I mean, it's his work. I would say that I totally support that. And in fact, I have a new article that just came out in Asian Studies Review just like a month ago, in which I talk about the post-75 insurgency in Laos and the fact that it was made out of people who came from a large range of ideological viewpoints. They were not just all right-wingers, as was often portrayed inside Laos. People generally believe that these were sort of lost causes. And that's the name of the book, actually, The Lost Causes. But I think there were, it was a fairly dynamic political environment, multi-party political situation in Laos, after between 54 and 75. And, there was a lot of political debates within Laos. And then after 75, when a lot of those people fled, in many ways, those political debates continued. The difference was that after 75, they didn't believe that the primary problem in Laos was the Lao communists. They believed that the Vietnamese, if they could talk to the Lao communists on their own, they believed that they could resolve things. They believed it was because of the Vietnamese. And therefore, all the political groups, most of the political groups, agreed that they would put their ideology aside temporarily in order to save the nation from Vietnamese colonialism, as they put it. And that afterwards, after they had freed the nation from Vietnamese colonialism, then they could take up their own political differences then. So in many ways, the research I've done is sort of a continuation of what Ryan has done. And, I think a lot of people don't realize the level of, multi-party democracy and political dialogue that was going on within the country prior to 75 and what that led to after 75.
Thank you. So Peter, you've asked an interesting question. I think it reminds me of the conversation we had before the panel where you said, the types of Cambodia scholars, it's like this alternative universe that would have been or could have been. But look, I think that my slides had some criticism of U.S. involvement. Obviously, if you don't come to democracy, democracy comes to you. I mean, the narrative that you're talking about is how Nixon, aside from my mention of the Nixon Doctrine, obviously the U.S. bombing campaign has been argued by Shawcross, Hitchens, and others as the reason why. First, Kissinger needs to be tried. He's dead now. But that essentially that led to enraging the Khmer Rouge and causing them to go crazy. And that's I've always been conflicted about that because I feel like we were supposed to be the good guys, the guys who were supposed to somehow stop communism. And then it turned out that in this narrative, in this alternative universe, it's us. We are the problem. We've met the enemy, and the enemy is us, or the call came from inside the house. Anyhow, look. It's possible. I've evolved in my views over the years. So maybe earlier I would have been totally right of that, and now I'm more accepting of that possibility. On your question about the embargo, I'd have to say I touched on it in mentioning punishing the poor, in the consequences of the U.S. supporting the UN seat, Cambodia's UN seat at the UN, that included the Khmer Rouge. And then this very strange sort of like, okay, Cambodia's come out of a genocide, and what we're going to do now is make sure that it gets nothing. Nothing at all, so that it's the Soviets and Eastern Bloc countries that end up helping it. I mean, it's a twisted situation. I think we can all agree on that. Before I hand it off to Tuong, to answer his part of that question. I was going to say, Tuong, you've got this whole, you had all these quotes, and they reminded me of how communisms across the world think of one another. In Cambodia, during the Khmer Rouge, the Khmer Rouge had radio broadcasts talking about how Romanian communism is only 2 horsepower communism, while their communism was 50 horsepower communism, the real communism. And then, Abel Guzman, the professor in Peru, leader of the Shining Path, said of Pol Pot that this guy is a petty bourgeois nationalist, and that only he, Guzman, knew the true Marxist-Leninist way. So again, always trying to outdo one another, criticizing the nationalism that separates them, but ultimately always falling back to nationalism.
Thanks for the question, Peter. I guess, as you know, the scholarship is predominantly U.S.-centric. So, I think I can talk about, U.S. problems with U.S. policies and so on, but I just want to use this opportunity as well as the few other opportunities that I have to, to get us, some kind of less U.S.-centric perspective. And, if you are interested in U.S.-centric perspectives, you can open any book about the Vietnam War by American authors, almost all of them. You can take any course on the Vietnam War on any campus in the U.S. I guarantee you 99% you get the U.S.-centric perspective. So I guess, why should I keep, repeating them? And I believe, in the post-war period, the U.S. was deeply divided about Vietnam, and then it also had, geopolitical interests elsewhere, dealing with the Soviet Union, China, Iran, and so on. And I think U.S. could not have been friendly to Vietnam, given, the defeat and so on. So, to expect U.S. to have been friendly to Vietnam was kind of, difficult to think. But U.S. could have been less hostile to Vietnam. That's certainly what was possible. And I think the Vietnamese blew the chance by demanding war reparations based on the Paris Peace Agreement, when it was them who violated the agreement, who conquered Saigon and then send hundreds of thousands of their people to prison, and now they were demanding war reparations. It's just ridiculous. What U.S. government would accept that? So I think I'm not trying to kind of just blame the Vietnamese, that's how I understand the situation. Thank you.
Okay, all right, so we're going to wrap it up because we got this dinner to go to. So I'd like to thank all our presenters and give them a round of applause. Thank you very much.